Hola. Greetings from 30 Dick and Karen in a celebration for your 50th anniversary. We would like to do a toast for everybody out there around the world. We're going to do a classic cocktail from the Prohibition era. It's called a Boilermaker. So we're going to do 3 CLs of Black Tot. Nice pour. And, of course, beer. This was very famous in the Prohibition era. So, for everybody out there, happy 50th. Love to everybody around the world. Cheers. Cheers. Pieces up.
I love that, man.
You saw it there first. One of the most complex cocktails in the planet to make, but one that is damn good.
Scotty, brother, I can't wait to be back over in Paris with you and see you for a daiquiri very soon. On to our next session then.
So this is a session where you get a break from Mitch and I because we are handing over
to the man
Dave
himself.
Broom. Let's bring Dave up live on stream because
Hello.
Dave,
Hello.
you've been a constant presence.
I can move.
How do you like? You can move. We're quite excited about that.
Yeah.
So Dave is hosting the next session, and he's giving us a break for an hour and a bit, which is maybe needed because both Mitch and I are absolutely starving. And since Daniele mentioned pizza, we've been dying to have pizza. So.
Before we planned this day, we thought, whatever we do, don't have pizza, it'll put us to sleep. But now we just really want pizza. So we're just going to see what happens.
Well, you think
So
we've
Dave,
got 20 hours to go, you know. So.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for the words of encouragement. I'm so glad you're one of my best friends. Who invited him? No, Dave, we're going to hand over to you to lead the next session because
Thank
this
you.
is going to be a really, really interesting, exciting session. So, Mr. Broom, the floor is yours.
See you later. Well, hello there, folks, and welcome to this session. You know, Mitch and Don getting a well-deserved break to hopefully have some food and hopefully not drink too much rum. Right, for the next session, we've got a fantastic look at rum history. In particular, looking at the history of rum in the Navy, since it is obviously celebration of Black Tot Day. Or did you actually celebrate Black Tot Day, or do you still kind of approach it with a certain amount of mourning? Anyway, we're going to be talking about history of rum. We're going to be talking about the Navy. We're going to be talking about a whole number of different topics. And I'm being joined by two absolutely fantastic rum historians. First of all, first coming up, Frank Ward, all the way from Barbados. Frank's family owned Mount Gay. He served as managing director at Mount Gay. He was the owner and producer of the amazing Mount Gilboa, and we'll hear a little bit more about Mount Gilboa, that legendary rum, in a wee while. And he also was a past chairman of WIRSPA, and really was one of the guiding lights and the driving forces between that for that first great genetic campaign, which I think really kick-started interest in rum all around the world. So welcome, Frank. How's it going out there in Barbados?
Hi, Dave. Nice to be here again, and I've started on the rum already.
Hey, good man, good man. Are you in your rocking chair again?
Nope, a different chair.
You've retired, so you say. You're a man of leisure, or are you?
I am officially retired, but that means I just don't have an office to go to.
I can't believe that you would just have a quiet life, Frank. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're going to be talking to you about Barbados, about rum in general, and about the evolution of the spirit over all these centuries. And my second guest is the cocktail wonk himself, Matt Pietrek, who's joining us from New Orleans.
Yeah, hello.
How are you doing? So yeah, a writer, the Wonk himself, website owner, and phenomenal rum historian who just this afternoon, as we were kind of running over what we might want to talk about, suddenly went, oh, by the way, I've just discovered this about Navy Rum. So we're going to come to that. I'm not going to give too much away at this point, Matt. Also a great educator as well. You do work for some work for WIRSPA.
Yeah.
Spreading the word about rum.
Yeah, I am the community envoy for WIRSPA, so sort of their interface between the producers and the rum enthusiast community.
That's fantastic. Great work going on. So what I think we'll do, we'll just kind of kick off. And I was wanting to kind of kick off with you, Matt. It's just going to be a general chat, so we're all going to be kind of chipping in. But given it is Black Tot Day, I do have a wonderfully large sample that Mitch sent me down. So I'm going to pour myself a little tot of the Black Tot and up spirits.
Yes, upstairs. I'm already drinking some of Frank's Mount Gilboa rum myself in an official half gill Navy issue cup.
Fantastic. This is really good. Ollie, you've done a great job. Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Cheers.
So as we're kind of sipping away on our Black Tot, Matt, what about the start of rum drinking in the Navy? I mean, when did it start, and why did it start?
So, great question, and there's a lot of confusion about this particular question. The best source of this information has been the Navy itself. One of the things I discovered in the British Navy archives a few years ago, or 18 months ago or so, was a fantastic document by the Navy itself, written to a person who was writing a book about sugar. But they answered a whole bunch of questions, and in the process basically put out an entire timeline of what they knew about Navy rum. And in some ways it differs from sort of this popular notion that we're told about when Navy rum started. In this document, they say that the earliest known ration issued to sailors was in 1655 in Jamaica, but it doesn't say it was Jamaican rum. And it was not a daily ration guaranteed, and it was not anywhere in the Navy. It was specifically in the Caribbean at the discretion of the commanders, if you will. It wasn't until 1731 that, again, the Navy sort of formally decreed in various regions you can have this kind of spirit, and that in the Caribbean rum was an option. But rum wasn't the only option. In fact, the cognac or brandy, they called it foreign brandy, was actually more dominantly served and or shipped out on ships to serve to sailors. And that continued up until the 1800s. And in fact, as late as 1804, I believe it is, the British Navy bought 625,000 gallons of cognac and only, I think, 250,000 gallons of rum. So it's an evolving story. There's no sort of big bang moment where it's like now all the sailors get the rum.
I mean, why were they drinking rum? I mean, why was there such a thing as a rum ration in the first place?
Great question. So in those days, when you went out to sea, you needed things to drink, and obviously water is a great thing to drink. But if you think about the containers they had at the time, where would they ship vast quantities of water? You can't just like dip down into the ocean and drink the salt water. So they would basically put what you're going to drink on board ships, and what they had in that era was wooden cask, and water in a wooden cask will start to go bad. It'll last a few days, maybe a week, from what I'm told. And it's like, okay, well, there's water. Well, what about beer? Beer has a little bit of alcohol, and beer would last a little bit longer, but same issue would follow it. Same with wine. They would also send out large quantities of wine in wooden puncheons. And so, they provisioned ships with basically, from what the documents say, is ships were provisioned with water, beer, wine, and then a spirit which, you know, coming from England very early on in those early days, may well have been brandy, for example. But once you were in the Caribbean and you needed to resupply, for example, well, rum, at least later on, past 1650 or so, once Caribbean rum really got started, rum would have been a common thing for them to resupply with. But as late as 1688, there's this great letter between a provisioner, like basically a merchant in the Caribbean, petitioning the Navy to say, I want to provision your ship with Jamaican rum, or with rum rather than brandy. Is that okay? So it wasn't always rum from the very beginning. Rum didn't really become the standard issue until 1806 or so.
I've also been very intrigued by, you know, Admiral Vernon, and, you know, and trying to standardize, you know, what must have been fairly rampant drunkenness on board ship,
right?
And the fact that what he created inadvertently was a kind of proto daiquiri. Yes,
exactly. The original rum issue was, at the time, was a half pint of rum a day, and they don't specify then, and whether it was cask strength or whether it was proof down before. The best assumption I have is that it was basically cask strength rum and a half pint of that. So, you know, at least 8 ounces of rum, which would have gotten sailors extremely drunk. And especially if they batched it up, which they were known to do. I wrote a story yesterday or the day before about how the sailors were batching up their rations and drinking them all in one fell swoop. But essentially, that much rum was going to get people drunk. In 1731, when the Navy issued is like, okay, this is now a standard thing. You can assume, the sailors can assume they'll get a daily ration from this point forward. It only took 9 years until 1740, when Vernon's like, okay, this is not working. We have to slow them down. We're not going to give them less rum, but we're going to slow them down with water. So basically, and at that time, it was 4 parts water to 1 part rum. So if you had 8 ounces of rum, you'd be given 32 ounces of water. So you got 40 ounces of liquid was your ration, which would have been pretty weak then. It would have been, at best, like 20 to 25% ABV, like a wine, maybe a strong wine. But people focus on that part of the order. But there's a later point of the order where it says something. I'm going to butcher the language here, but they that are good husbands may pour the savings of their bread and flour ration into lime and sugar. Essentially saying, as I understand it, is like you can choose to not purchase bread. You can purchase lime and sugar to mix with this grog. And as we all know, daiquiri is rum, lime, and sugar. So it would have been, a very early daiquiri, and not well shaken.
Excellent. Yeah, unless it's stormy at sea, I suppose.
Yes.
Finally, before we move on to looking at Barbados specifically, I'm just intrigued about the role of the Navy in terms of popularizing rum. I mean, do you think there's any truth in that idea that the Navy were kind of the first rum brand ambassadors in some way?
So that's a great question. I haven't actually pondered it in that specific context. I mean, we do know that Navy rums as a style, and we may touch on this later, but Navy rums as a style appear as early as 1870 or so, and so it's entirely possible that people who served in the Navy, 1800s, 1850s, people who served in the Navy got out, when they were retired from the Navy, and they still like their rum, and tell their friends about the great Navy rum that they had.
No, that's fantastic. It's great, Frank. Given that we're still kind of there in the Caribbean in fairly early days, what about Barbados? Barbados as the first really great rum producing country, or certainly the first sugar producing country in the Caribbean. So therefore, must have been the first to make rum as well. What can you tell us about those early days? Not that you were there.
Yeah, well, I think the first recorded instance of rum being made in Barbados was at Three Houses Plantation in St. Philip in the 1650s, I believe. And but what has struck me about the history of rum in Barbados is that there's very little written about how the rum was actually made. We know that it was made from, according to Richard Ligon, the skimmings from the boiling of the sugarcane juice. But exactly what the process was, it's still somewhat of a mystery. Yes, they would have used copper pots, pot stills, and obviously the inoculation of the skimmings would have been wild yeast present in the atmosphere. But the actual process of fermentation and distillation, little, if any, has been recorded about that. But having said that, there is no denying that the popularity of rum increased, even though at that time it didn't taste really good. And from contemporary writings at the time, it was, quote unquote, the favorite drink of the lower classes. Right? So the planter classes, even though they would have drunk rum, they seem to have preferred the imported European spirits, the wines and the Madeiras and the cognacs.
Have you? Where do you stand on the idea? Either of you? Where do you stand on the idea it was actually the Dutch that brought distillation into Barbados rather than the British?
I would not disbelieve that, because they're saying that sugarcane came to Barbados via Brazil.
Yeah, that was my thinking, and given the Dutch planters in Brazil, and probably I think Guyana by that time were probably distilling as well, then there's perhaps a plausible theory that distillation actually arrived with them rather than coming across from Europe.
Let me say
the distinction that I would make here is that, and it's really the wording. Rum as we know it today was probably first distilled in Barbados. That does not mean that the sugarcane spirit itself was first distilled in Barbados, by no means. So I'm very precise in saying that rum as we know it today.
Right. Insofar as, can you expand on that? Rum as we know it today as being what?
Well, as I said, you cannot. Well, first of all, sugarcane is not native to this part of the world. Right? So wherever sugarcane was grown previously, there must have been, at some point in time, some sort of distillate made from the juice of the sugarcane. And that would have gone back to long before sugarcane actually arrived in the Caribbean. So you will have a spirit that's like rum, but it's not quite rum. And the difference is the method of production. And that's where I say there's very, very little information on how rum as we know it today was actually produced in the early days in Barbados. Other than you would have used the molasses, and also you would have used the copper pot stills, which would have come from, as you say, maybe the Dutch, which I would believe, rather than the British. So the information on how rum was made, it's very, very, very scarce.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that in itself is really interesting. Because do you think Barbados that history in Barbados has perhaps been forgotten to some extent, Matt? That people are, when you think of Caribbean rum, and you think of obviously rum being made in Barbados, but maybe that role as the place where it all started has perhaps been overlooked in recent times.
I would have to say that the Barbadian company, who has really captured that space is Mount Gay Rum. When their strap lines, it was the rum that invented rum. Yeah, but there is not a lot of recognition among the general public that there were a plethora of distilleries in Barbados leading up to the early 20th century, because almost every plantation had, a small still, and it doesn't take a great deal of space. And some of these plantations would only have been maybe 100 acres, 200 acres, so they were quite small.
Yeah. But it would have been absolutely everywhere on the island, yeah. And the connection then between Barbados in the Navy? Was Barbadian rum being used in the Navy rums? Because I believe that the links weren't necessarily with Britain. The links were more with North America rather than across the Atlantic. So did the Navy kind of bring in Barbadian rum in those early days, Matt?
So I would like to think, based upon what was available where, if it was in fact true that, the British sailors first got rum in Jamaica in 1655, we know Barbados was making rum by then. We don't believe that there was much in the way of Jamaican rum production then. It had just been captured by the British, and even though it seems there was sugar being grown in Jamaica prior to that, basically when the Spanish owned Jamaica or controlled Jamaica, there's evidence that they're making sugar and possibly distilling early on. But if you look at like the population of Jamaica at that time that the British were able to take over it doesn't lend a whole lot of credence to a whole lot of Jamaican rum being made at that moment in time. Certainly not, 300 estates making rum. Barbados was probably further ahead there. And of course the islands might trade with each other. So it's entirely possible that the British sailors in Jamaica actually got Barbadian rum. We'll probably never know that. But when you start looking at the contracts, the available, basically the thing with this data is the further along in history you get, the more resolution you have. And so resolution in the 1600s is very low. 1700s is even not so great. But you can see like rum purchase, a few rum purchase records, and they, at that point in time, the British themselves were not really considering rum to be these sort of like distinct terroirs like we think of them today. They weren't quite as much thinking about, well, this is Barbados rum and this is Jamaica rum and this is this is Demerara rum. It was just pretty much all agricultural produce. Rum was always secondary to sugar. They would, the goal was to get as much sugar as you could out of the Caribbean, and if you happen to have enough molasses left over for your plantation to make rum, great. But it was not rum the way we see it being made today, whereas like Demerara rum has a well-defined thing, and they're always making the same thing. It was just very much, it was a commodity sort of independent of the island.
Sure. Now, when did that begin to shift? Because I'm thinking at Martin's book on like Planter's Guide and everything, and I think once you begin to get into the 18th century, it strikes me that a lot more care is being taken over distillation. It was probably relatively crude to begin with, but there appears to be quality controls getting.
For sure. I mean, essentially, we see
in the 18th century, trying to understand cooling fermentation, cooler distillation.
Right. Yeah, I think, in terms of dunder, we think that was used fairly early on. Like if you go back far enough in the records, definitely early 1800s, if not earlier, you'll see, dunder seemed to be a common process used across the Caribbean. They hadn't really developed these sort of distinct styles. It wasn't like in the 1700s that the Martinique rum was cane juice rum. It was, again, very much of a commodity thing. And so if you're going to try to tease apart and say like, well, when did the mainstream British, the Navy or consumers or the merchants start trying to separate this stuff out, you can only go off of things like what was listed in newspapers, for example, or merchant records, which are incredibly hard to find. But like within a newspaper, you would often see, so-and-so has so many puncheons of rum, and you might see 50 puncheons of Jamaica rum and 20 puncheons of Leeward Islands rum. They weren't, you would never, or I've never seen where it's like, oh, this is St. Lucia rum, and this is St. Kitts rum, and this is, Montserrat rum. It was very much, again, not something that they were necessarily differentiating. I think, early on, Jamaica got a reputation for quality. But as best as I can tell, the move of Jamaica towards sort of the more powerful high hogo, things like Wedderburn, Plummer and Wedderburn marks and that kind of thing, didn't actually seem to start around 1800 or so, or maybe after that. We'll never know. It may have been earlier, but I can only go off the evidence that I'm seeing of a Jamaican rum being differentiated and a Plummer style rum. We don't really see that until the 1800s.
Yeah, and Frank, I mean, I recall reading some old historical records about Barbadian rum, and actually sort of saying that it's not Jamaican. So when Jamaica began to define itself as being kind of the big, powerful, funky style that people turn to, there's a very clear differentiation between the Jamaican way of making rum and the Bajan way of making rum, which appears to be double distillation as against maybe a single pass.
Yeah. Well, also you must remember that size matters, in that the amount of arable land under sugarcane cultivation in Jamaica was considerably greater than that in Barbados, and also certainly in the Leeward and Windward Islands. So with the scale of production, you're then able to create for yourself a distinctive identity with respect to making rum, which Jamaica, I think, because of its size, was able to do to a greater extent than a number of the other islands, because of course they will also be exporting a lot more rum from the island than say from Barbados or from the Leeward and Windward Islands. And if you have that acreage available to you, naturally it would lend itself to a greater degree of, shall we say, experimentation. So I think that the prominence of Jamaican rum in those years is primarily due to its size.
Okay. That's a very very clear argument, actually. Yeah, that's good. I mean, moving the discussion on just a little bit. I mean, there's one area that I wanted to touch on. I think it's particularly relevant with what's going on rightly around the world, which is the links between sugar production and therefore rum production and slavery. Do you think that is an area that really hasn't been discussed in as much depth as it should have been? I'm thinking, Matt, initially, I know I've mentioned it in books. I know you've mentioned it, but should there be greater examination over that? Kind of the truth of rum's origins.
I mean, absolutely. It was a hellaciously horrible thing that went down. I don't know anybody who's ever seen an image of the slave ships, sort of like this top view image of a slave ship and how they loaded slaves, enslaved people onto the ships, like literally like sardines in a can. I've never seen anybody who's seen that image and just like, oh my God, like this, like I had no idea. So yeah, it's definitely something I think people should know more about, and there's actually plenty of history out there. There are you see pamphlets going back even the 1700s. Basically pamphlets were there sort of. At that time, they would basically write 50, 100-page pamphlets like advocating for a particular position, and you see even in the 1700s, sort of the abolitionist movements start to come up, and so there's a lot of information out there if you're willing to look for it and look look in the old archival documents rather than what somebody's written 20 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, why do you think it's been an area that perhaps hasn't been examined properly? I mean, I've been talking to historians in Scotland. There's a lot of work going on about Scotland's relationship with the Caribbean, and it's almost like a completely new area of historical study. Frank, what do you think about this?
I've got an opinion in that you cannot, certainly in the Caribbean, you cannot dissociate the production of sugar from the production of rum, because nobody in the Caribbean would, at that time, would have, created a plantation simply to produce rum. Rum was the byproduct of sugar production. So all of the iniquities related to slavery and the production of sugar would also apply to the production of rum.
Yeah.
And many of the merchants, say in the UK, who would have imported sugar from the Caribbean, would also, I suspect, have been importing rum also. So the two cannot be separated. And as far as I'm concerned, anything that relates to the history of slavery and sugar, it applies absolutely to rum itself.
Yeah, I would agree 100%, and it's been very interesting, sort of examining Glasgow. You know, and I'm from Glasgow, and you know, I was brought up. You know, I used to kind of walk down Jamaica Street and over Jamaica Bridge, and you know, not think anything of it, and then suddenly, you know, everything begins to click, and you go, well, where did all these why did all these merchants make all this money? And then you realize that, you know, in the 18th century, a quarter of the white population in Jamaica were Scots, and estates like Hampden, you know, Hampden Park, which is famous for football, you know, estates like Hampden were owned by Scottish merchants, and the wealth of Scotland and the wealth of the city that I was brought up in was built on sugar, not on slavery, because it wasn't a slave port, but it was built on sugar.
Yeah.
And therefore, even though it was kind of one step removed, you know, and I think this is the way that Scotland's kind of got away with it. You know, it wasn't like Liverpool or Bristol.
Right.
It's still, you know, the fact is, you know, the wealth of the nation was built on the back of slavery, and it's just not been talked about.
There's some fantastic, not a timeline. I'm drawing a blank on the word, but basically animation that shows basically ships, enslaved people's ships, going from Africa and where they're going to in the New World, basically the Americas, the Caribbean, and as you know, progresses over time, and you see, you know, what starts out as sort of like, you know, a few dots going across the screen, you know, and by the 1800s, it's just like it's a flood. It's like it's a solid line of ships going from Africa, and you know, like each ship, it would have been, you know, 100, 200 people, I believe. And it's just staggering, and you see, you know, the Caribbean and obviously the southern part of the U.S., but Brazil. It's just insane how many of them went to Brazil.
Yeah, and also with Cuba as well, you know, which abolished slavery considerably later than anywhere else. You know, you get that huge late influx of slavery suddenly building the Cuban rum industry and indeed, obviously, the sugar industry. Yeah, I mean, it's just, I think it's important that, you know, we face up to this and we begin to, you know, do the same degree of historical research into this as we're doing into, you know, rum's origins and all the fascinating company histories and, you know, the secrets of Dunder. Well, you know, there's other areas of rum that I think are equally valid. In fact, maybe more valid to discuss at this particular point in time.
Yeah, and there's a something I've posted. There's a great book. I think it was around 1823 or so, but a great book that basically, and I forget the name of it. I posted some of the images. I have a rum history forum. I posted some of the images there, and they're basically color drawings, and they're just astounding. You know, you see slavery at every stage of the process, like slaves, like planting the fields, slaves harvesting the cane, slaves, you know, running the cane mill, slaves fermenting, distilling, rolling barrels down to the scene. It's like it really sort of makes it very graphically real as to what was happening.
It's an interesting point, that, Frank, actually, isn't it? I mean, in much the same way as Jack Daniels was trained by a black slave, it would have been the slaves who were the distillers.
Yes, of course. So that's why I'm saying that there needs to be a little bit more research done specifically on the history of how rum was actually made, rather than it just being made from sugarcane juice. You mentioned that in the early 1800s, you know, you began to see the emergence of the various marks out of Jamaica. But I'm talking not just about that, but how did they use inoculate their fermentation, the mash? What sort of copper pot design did they use? I'll give you an example. Up until the early 1960s, I do know that a lot of production of rum at the distillery in St. Lucie, the water came from water collected off the roofs after rain. They're collected in huge cisterns.
Wow. Yep. So there is so much to discover still, and talking about how rum was made, and doing investigation into how Barbadian rum was made like all those years ago. What about Navy rum? You hear, what was the recipe? Was there a fixed recipe for Navy rum? That's the first question, and then we're going to move on to Deptford vats, which I'm fascinated by.
So we always hear about the vaunted Navy rum recipe, and I would say at any one moment in time there was a recipe, but it changed dramatically over time, and that prior to about 1806, it doesn't appear that the Navy was actually doing its own blending. They were just basically contracting with merchants to supply the fleet out in the field with puncheons of rum, and whatever it was, as long as it was good enough. We don't really see the Navy specifically blending until the early 1800s, and it's fascinating. People think of Navy rum as a blend of rums from British colonies, Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana. In the 1840s, for example, the East Indies rum from India was substantially purchased as part of as the Navy rum blend. So it changed even in the 20th century. It changed a fair amount. It had settled down by the 20th century with the core components, but even the small components, we see them change ever so slightly. But by the 20th century, a blend of Guyana rums and Trinidad rums, specifically Caroni, if you want to get into it, were sort of the backbone of the Navy blend.
Yeah, and you did uncover some remarkable stuff just recently, haven't you? Yeah. So go on to Cocktail Wonk to see the latest discoveries.
Yes, it's
And also, maybe it didn't matter to that extent that the recipe wasn't fixed, because the method of production is those legendary, quasi-mythical, huge vats that they had in Deptford, the fixed vats, which were kind of like a proto-rum Solera, as far as I can work out. I mean, how much have you discovered about that?
A fair amount, but far less than I would like to discover. I'll add really quick that we may talk about the Deptford vats, but they were actually blending elsewhere in Plymouth and Gosport as well. So there was actually 3 vittling yards, but Deptford was the main one, the one where they had the biggest vats. We know as early as 1840. So let me back up. Basically, there was a fantastic era in the 1800s where every time the Navy would need more rum, they would put out a contract bid in a newspaper and say, yea, verily, the Navy wants 200,000 gallons of rum to be delivered over the course of 6 weeks. We need 100,000 gallons go to Deptford, 50,000 gallons go to Gosport, or what have you. And then every once in a while, you'd see another announcement like, yea, verily, Lemonheart and Sons has, won the contract to supply 50,000 gallons of rum. So we kind of have an idea of how much the Navy was buying and where it was going, but it didn't really give you a lot more detail than that. So the earliest example of mention of a vatting system at Solera is around 1840.
Okay.
Yeah, and that so we know there were vatting systems in 1840, and then it's not until the late 1800s, early 1900s that we get this description of the number of vats. I think it was 25 or 32, I forget exactly. But the total, at its peak, the total capacity of these vats was around 250,000 gallons. And to put that, and the largest vat was 32,000 gallons. To put that in scale, the West India docks across the river, which was sort of like the consumer side of British rum, where they had 4 million gallons of rum over at the West India docks. When the merchants needed to blend it for export or for bottling or putting in cask or whatever, their vatting system was around 62,000 gallons. So in contrast, the Navy had 250,000 gallons. And it's interesting, there's a few reports that talk about them being open vatted, which seems crazy, and you want to ask, like, is that really true? Were they really just not putting a cover on these vats? But there's a great story it's just been repeated many times in different sources, but essentially a great story about how there was a dog that belonged to one of the supervisors, and that dog was always seen wandering around the edge of these vats, and always, in and out of all this vatting system. And then one day they disappeared. It was the last seen, with that vat over there. And they're thinking, okay, well, next time we, go to clean these vats out, we empty the vat to clean it, we'll find a pickled dog at the bottom of this vat. But they didn't. There was a dog to be found, but what they did find was a collection of glass bottles on the bottom, every one of them with a piece of string attached to it, and that string was just tall enough to reach the top of the vat. And the logic being, it's like, I'm sure they did this in Scotch whiskey as well. That is like, when nobody's looking, you take a thief, you pull it up, and there's your rum. And so again, that likely wouldn't have happened if these vats were closed. Like, you wouldn't have found this collection of bottles out there with a closed vat. Sort of like, and the idea was that the worker, like, if they're about to get caught, just drop it, and there's no evidence.
Not me. Yeah, in Scotland, we have this thing called Heinz salad cream, and the Heinz salad cream bottle fits exactly into the bunghole of a Scotch whiskey barrel. So that's what was widely used. Sales of salad cream were huge around about distilleries.
Yeah.
I'm also interested in terms of blending, and for both of you here, because when I was growing up, the people who were drinking rum were drinking Navy rum. So it was dark rum. So it was things like Black Heart, etc., etc. And you look back and you see a lot of Scottish merchants who are beginning to blend rums, a Guyana blend or a Jamaican blend, right at the tail end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. And these rums became very similar to what was the Navy style. So it's kind of, what came first? Was this kind of consumer driven, or was this these brands picking up on what the Navy were drinking and actually beginning to copy what the Navy were drinking? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that is a fascinating question, and one of the biggest areas I keep running into no information on is, what were the blenders thinking? Like, what were their process? What were they thinking? That's the hardest part to really get any real insights there. We do know that as early as 1870 that the Lemonheart, I believe it was Lemonheart, and strangely you see it advertised first in Australia before you see it in the UK. But Lemonheart was selling, or somebody, I think it was Lemonheart, was selling a Navy rum. And they, and I don't see other evidence of other sort of consumer rum blends that were also multi-island. So, we have Navy rum as early as 1870. It didn't really seem to take off as a large, sort of like heavily promoted consumer thing until around the 1930s, 1940s. As Lemonheart was a Navy rum, and they're not a Navy rum. Lamb's Navy rum, obviously. Rope and Anchor, a few more. I'm drawing some blanks on some of their names there. But it's interesting thing about those as well, and the thing that always strikes me is like they're not at all Navy rums, is because you think about it, like, it was Lemonheart Demerara Navy rum. It was not a blend of rums. It was Caroni Trinidad Navy rum. It wasn't a multi-blend rum. And so it's just like I think like people at the time didn't notice the sort of the contradiction in labeling them as Navy rums.
That's really interesting. It's fascinating, and also it leads me into, because we're kind of moving through time very nicely here, although time itself is beginning to run away with us. But talking, about tail end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, Frank, and about the Ward family and Mount Gay. So could you maybe give us a background into your family's involvement in rum and what was happening in Barbados to stimulate that interest?
My family's involvement in rum came about in around 1918. And my great grandfather bought the Mount Gay plantation. And he bought it with a functioning distillery on site. It was primarily pot stills. And at that time, the distillery in St. Lucie did have a reputation for producing a superior quality pot still rum because it was, for the most part, double distilled rum. He would have introduced the first column still for the distillery in, I think, the early 1920s. And that was probably the origin of why you see that a lot of the Mount Gay brands of that era always had refined, because with the column still distillation, the rums became a lot lighter and therefore, shall we say, a lot more palatable. But he certainly was not the first one to introduce a column distillation to Barbados. I believe that honor goes to the Hanshaw brothers in the late 1890s. Yeah. But certainly with the introduction of the column still, and the blends became a lot lighter, therefore more palatable. And he took on a business partner to John F. Hudson to market the rum. And it is from those origins that Mount Gay rum actually rose to prominence at that time.
Right.
And then throughout the years, it just continued to grow in popularity and also in terms of brand recognition. But the distillery itself was always very, very small. And certainly during the war years in the early 1940s, and it was producing quite a lot of rum on demand, and the distillery actually burnt down completely because most of the buildings were made of wood, and it had to be completely rebuilt, and it did so with both the column still and the pot still. And at that time, because of the quality of the pot still rum, that gave Mount Gay its signature taste at the time. So he was probably the first to really move the perception of rum and the quality of rum up a notch. Certainly within Barbados.
Yeah.
And most people would not remember, if you're of a certain age, that Mount Gay actually used to make a pot still rum, which was double distilled, and it was, I think, aged for 8 years, and they may have been a 15-year blend also. But it was made in very small quantities, and it was eventually discontinued in the early 80s. Now, ironically, in this day and age, that would have been sold, at a premium. It would have been extremely popular among the connoisseurs. But at that time, only very few people drank it. Eclipse was the favorite blend, and sugarcane brandy was the premium blend at the time. So there is an evolving, progression of consumer tastes and response to consumer tastes, whether it was driven by the distillery or the distillery responded to a change in consumer tastes, I am not sure. Certainly in the latter years, by the 1970s, the techniques changed in response to the consumer taste, because the two column still that was present at the distillery until 1975, I believe, it was made of copper, basic two column coffee still, and that was decommissioned because the type of rum it made was a little too heavy for the perceived consumer taste of the day.
Wow, wow. So a continual evolution of flavor all the way through. Well, when was Mountgay? When was Mountgay originally exported? Was it just for domestic market for a long time, or
No,
did the rest of the world see it?
it was always an export-oriented rum, but contrary to belief, it was never ever a volume producer because the distillery, as I said, was very small. But it always exported rum. Part of the production was consumed in Barbados, but it certainly did export rum to Europe, to the U.S., to North America, U.S., Canada, and also to Australia, I believe.
Yeah.
So it always had an international footprint, but the volumes were not very big.
I have a question for Frank. So something that's I think confuses a lot of people, and you can elaborate on, is the differentiating between the distillery and the brand in those early years when like distilleries weren't allowed to sell directly to consumers. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
That is correct. The distillery was located at the Mountgay plantation, and at that time, the distillery could not sell rum that was produced at the distillery within a certain distance of the distillery. So my great-grandfather then set up Mountgay Distilleries Limited in conjunction with John F. Hudson to market the product of the distillery. And that was based in Bridgetown. The first location, I think, was in Cheapside. So there were always two separate Mountgay companies. So Mountgay Distilleries Limited was the marketing arm, and at that time, the distillery was part of what was called Fairfield and Mountgay Limited, which was a number of plantations, and the only plantation then that had the distillery was Mountgay. And interestingly, it was called the refinery when the two operations were split, because carrying on from my great-grandfather, where he looked at the production of rum as being more refined than that of other companies, so the distillery was called the refinery, the rum refinery, rather than just a rum distillery.
Right.
So there's always a play on the description refinery.
That's interesting, because I've always thought refinery is a really bad word for a distillery. For it, it sounds too much like oil production. But it was actually intended completely the opposite way.
But I said, if you look at some of the older labels of Mountgay, they will say refined rum.
Yeah, and then some say redistilled as well. We had this debate this week as well.
Yeah, the redistilled. It's basically pot still rum distilled two separate occasions.
Right.
And that is where is basically double distilled. So again, the history of that, of it being called redistilled rather than double distilled, was that redistilled sounded a little bit more refined than double distilled.
But yeah, I think again, this kind of story, and for me, this kind of comes back to Barbados as the home of rum and the start of rum. At a time in the 20th century when a lot of rum was becoming just basically a commodity spirit, and it was losing prestige. There you have Mountgay exporting around the world, really being a pioneer, I would say, for a new rum appreciation, which took a long time to come. But you've been doing it for considerably longer than I think perhaps people give you credit for.
Yeah, but the thing is, and let's not forget that up until, I would think for me, the mass market in Barbados, it changed its perception of rum with the introduction of Mountgay Extra Old. Prior to that, the premium, sophisticated spirit to drink was Scotch whiskey, specifically Johnny Walker.
Yeah. But yeah, the allure of the imported is an incredibly powerful thing. I'm now also drinking some Mount Gilboa here. So Frank, can you tell us a little bit about Mount Gilboa? What was the idea and what's happened?
It's very simple because the distillery at the time I was running it did not have the brand. It sold all of its production to the Mount Gay brand. And I thought that we needed really to have our own brand. Of course, we couldn't use Mount Gay, but the family had registered a company years ago called Mount Gilboa Investments Limited. And the original name for the Mount Gay plantation was Mount Gilboa.
Ah.
So I said, that is an ideal brand name. Then I had a problem with what kind of rum am I going to make? Because seeing as all of the production goes to Mount Gay, it cannot taste like Mount Gay rum. So I did some trials and I settled on a pure pot still rum because there were very few distilleries making pots that had the pot still rum capability, full stop, end of story, let alone producing a pure pot still rum. So I hit upon the triple distillation after some trials because I did up to 5 distillations. And the one that really hit the sweet spot and that was completely different was the triple distilled pot still rum. The actual distillations for each varied from distillation, from first distillation to second distillation to third distillation. So there was a lot of trial and error there. And also when it came to the aging, for me, because I made it according to my preference, that the 4 years old was the sweet spot, because older than that, it started to lose its distinctive, powerful, coppery aftertaste. So I settled upon a triple distilled aged for 4 years. That's basically it. Because I just didn't want to have a rum that tasted like the Mount Gay.
So you also had a an unaged expression, which I find extremely interesting. And you were telling me that you were targeting something very surprising in that one.
Yeah, tequila. Unaged tequila sells at a significant premium to unaged rum. And I didn't see why it should. So I set out to make a white rum, again, triple distilled, pure pot still, but without the need to age it. Because pot still rums in general, they're not that good. Oops, hang on.
I think Frank's fallen over.
Oh no!
we will continue. What Mount Gilboa are you drinking there, Matt?
No, I have one of the very earliest labels they have, and I think this one may have been a UK import. I think, but I have a few other bottles of a newer label, but I also happen to have one bottle of the unaged that Frank gave to me when I met him in Barbados in the end of 2017 or so, or 2018. Yeah. So yeah, and it does have that tequila note to it. So it's quite interesing.
It's an utterly delicious rum. I'm a huge fan of Gilboa. Oh, you're back, Frank. Good. I'm glad.
I dropped my phone. No, but the white rum, I said, I would like to make it so that it had similar qualities to an unaged tequila. So it is a triple distilled rum, but the distillation process is slightly different. And I had an eye to producing a pot still rum that did not need to be aged to reduce the harshness.
Fantastic. That's amazing. And it worked. Yeah, Matt was saying he still got a bottle, and I've been invited to try it. Yeah, so that's very kind of you.
About 500 cases, that's all.
Guys, we're beginning to run out of time. So a very quick last question. Navy rum. Okay, it's Black Tot Day. Navy no longer drinks it because it's not wise to have people in charge of nuclear weapons drinking rum. So I can fully understand it. So Navy rum, nostalgia or a valid style?
I think it's a valid style. I think from my perspective, there is a couple key definitions of what were essential to Navy rum, and even if we don't make it in that same way anymore, or even if we couldn't make it in the same way anymore, we can still achieve a particular flavor profile. And in my book, Navy rum without Port Morant in it is not a Navy rum. There's that particular Port Morant note that you just immediately pick out, and you know it's Port Morant. It's a dark. It's relatively young, not unaged, but relatively young rum integrated together, and you know I think it's a wonderful style.
Yep, that's good. And are you seeing? You think that is there much consumer interest? Can you see or bartender interest in that style?
Yeah.
I mean, you're beginning to see it. You know, obviously Black Tot's come out.
Yeah.
Gosling's is there, Pussers is there.
I think it's interesting. It's one interesting thing that popped out is that in terms of, you know, if you think where is rum being used like more in cocktails, obviously the tiki market, you know, sort of tropical tiki market is where a lot of the today's sort of leading edge thought is in terms of like rum usage. You know, they brought in rum agricoles and super fungi rums and clarins, and they're doing all sorts of interesting things with rum. And when we think of the Navy rums of the 40s and 50s and the birth of tiki, like surely there must have been classic tiki recipes that use Navy rum, but the reality is I can't find any. Tiki recipes that use a Demerara rum, but nothing that specifically called for a Navy rum in tiki recipes. I think it's great to see. Now we have a choice of different brands, sort of with their interpretation of what a Navy rum should be, and I think the market will decide if they're viable. But I personally am a big fan of them.
Yeah, Frank, what's your opinion of the Navy style?
Dave, I'm not a fan of the Navy style of rum because my taste in rums tend to be more to medium light. But certainly, again, I think that that if you're going to produce a Navy rum, at least try to adhere to what evidence is available as to what Navy rum used to represent then. Whether it will have, if you look at the original, whether it does have legs in this commercially consumer-driven market, it's another question. But its survival will depend ultimately on how it is perceived by the consumer.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, that, because I remember when I used to kind of judge spirits competitions on rum panels with Karsten, who I believe is lurking out there, and there was always like huge fights amongst people. Some of the older school rum producers loved the Navy style, and anything that wasn't Navy rum wasn't rum, and agricole was disgraceful. And those of us who liked agricole were going, well, actually, that Navy rum, I'm really not very sure about that. And can never actually get this consensus, just judging rum in terms of its own individual quality. Do you think these days are changing, that people are becoming less entrenched in their opinions?
I would tell you what I would like to see.
Yeah.
For me, I would like to see a resurgence of interest in white rums, and I'm not talking about the really super distilled white rums. I'm talking about a 2-column distillate or a pot still distillate, because for me, the best expression of a distiller's art is how he makes his white rum, because it is not then modified by aging or anything like that. So if a distiller can make an excellent white rum that's unaged, unmodified in any way, that to me speaks to his ability to create a rum.
Rum should not be molasses vodka.
No. I'm not talking about molasses vodka. You take the white triple distilled Mount Gilboa. Yeah, that's a white rum, but it's not aged. It's got nothing added to it. It's just an unaged white rum, and I think that is for me, that's my personal opinion, one area which is underserved, a really, really good, flavorful, unaged white rum, because the image of white rum, I think, needs to be changed.
That's great. That's a really good point, Matt. Do you want to pick up on that? And
Yeah.
is there now greater consensus? And no, I should. I'll keep it with. What would you like to see?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great. I think it's in the last, say, 5 years or so, we've seen a rum market that's exploded in terms of interest in all sorts of styles. Like the fact that, we just have much more, available to us. Like, if you would have told me 5 years ago something like Hampton DOK or Doc Rum would have been available, I would have laughed at you. But now it's like you have multiple expression. You have an aged expression. We have the Clarence from Haiti. We just have this, emerging cornucopia of really interesting stuff out there, and I think it's great. We have the enthusiasts, leading some of the enthusiasts, leading the movement, but also bartenders as well. And they're like finding new and innovative ways to bring these flavors in, these sort of new flavors in the way that they previously have been playing around with things like with mezcals or unaged tequilas or sotol or those other sort of interesting flavors. I think the rise of the craft cocktail movement and like what else can we do has been really beneficial for bringing more of these interesting rums that aren't sort of the mainstream what everybody expects type of rums. Again, so it's fantastic.
Talking about an emerging cornucopia, I see that Mitch and Dawn have rejoined us.
We're back from the dead.
And you've changed.
Good about me, Dave.
And interesting enough, we poured ourselves a white rum.
Very good.
We thought we'd kick off with the little Clarence Soju for the next 12 hours just to get us going. So.
Just to kickstart the machine back into action.
It's very good with Riesling, I believe.
Yes, it's very good with Riesling. I have tried to mix the both. I will now be kicked out of the MW Institute. Thank you very much, Dave.
It's fine. It's fun anyway.
Have you guys had a good time? It's we've been listening to a bit while we've been eating and kind of generally trying to put ourselves together, and it sounded fantastic. So
I found it an absolute ball. The guys have been amazing. The amount of information that they managed to divulge and pull out in a relatively short space of time has been extraordinary. Thank you so much, Frank. Thank you so much, Matt. It's been great. We could talk all night. I've got pretty much an entire bottle of Mango Boa, so we could talk all night.
We can go offline and do a Zoom chat. So, I mean, well, we're celebrating because, gentlemen, we've made it to halfway. So I think a wee celebration to that because...
What are you guys drinking? What's in your cups at the moment?
Mango Boa for me.
Go ahead, Frank.
I've got something special here. This is a 15-year-old column still rum that we bottled in 1992. This is at the distillery. Interesting story. We found a barrel that was just lying around in one of the storerooms that was not part of the inventory, and we thought it was empty. And when we tried to move it, we realized that there was rum in it, and it was 15 years old. So we just bottled it. And I have the last.
Amazing.
That was since
we're coming around to yours later,
we're
Frank.
coming around to yours, Frank.
We've been offered many trips to Barbados. Miguel Smith, who I believe is still here, has already promised me multiple times to take me back. So, hey, we're en route. Yeah. The flight is booked. So, Matt, what are you drinking?
I have made my own Navy blend while we're drinking. So,
awesome.
And some Pastel Barbados. So.
There we go. Our job is done. Yeah,
that's it. No, you guys are amazing. You probably gave Mitch and I a well-needed rest, I think. Yeah.
I don't think we would have been able to do the next 12 hours without you. So.
Actually, for me, sorry, Matt.
I get to just watch.
Well, we've got some pretty cool speakers coming up, so I think everyone's going to bring us through. And what's amazing, I'm seeing the same names still on the feed, which is just amazing. So, audience out there, Rumspect, you have been incredible. Thank you so much for kind of keeping us going, I guess. But no, absolutely awesome. And so, when you go off the stream, are you going? You're going to be continuing on with us for a couple of hours. I know Matt's is going to push on through, which is fabulous.
Oh, sure. I have to keep my hour on this, so yes, of course I am.
Yes, I will be continuing. I will be watching.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And Dave is by default.
So Dave's here.
Did you see baby Dave?
That's a life-size one. Yeah.
Did you explain that, Don? Did you explain it?
Yes, for anyone who's I guess who's just joining us. Yes,
we will explain Dave Broom. So because coronavirus is upon us, and we decided we needed to social distance and to maintain that social distance. And apparently it was 2 meters was the social distance when we started this project. So we decided there was only one way to measure 2 meters, and that was with a broom. Because as we know, all brooms are 2 meters, apparently. So we didn't just want any broom. We wanted a Dave Broom. Because this is the only way to social distance. But then we figured maybe it was a little bit hard for Mitch to be on camera at the same time, because apparently 2 meters is quite far. So we thought we'd still abide by Boris's rules and stay a broom apart, but just a baby broom.
It's nice to be yeah. People have always social distanced for me anyway, so nothing changes. Yeah.
Well, Dave, I cannot wait to have a hug from you when I'm allowed, because Dave gives great hugs, and I am a hugger. So, Dave, you have to stay on for when Ian comes on, because Ian's going to have daiquiris with us a bit later, which is going to be pretty cool.
Oh, that'll be cool. Excellent.
Yeah, so we've had a bit of a laugh. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw Tristan and Craig Harper's daiquiri with some old flagon of rum, which I think Craig was mainly drinking from the flagon.
I think Craig had drunk most of the flagon, but there was a little bit left for a daiquiri. So,
but no, I think we've been so lucky. We've had some amazing speakers. I hope you guys have enjoyed. If you've been catching any of them, I think they've been incredible. I think every time we come off, we're like, that was the best one. And then we're like, but the other one was so good.
I thought Sean did an amazing job. Like, I loved the Sean talk.
Amazing. I think we could have spoken to Sean for a couple more hours. He was insane.
I was incredibly lucky. I spent 3 days with him in Guyana. So we got completely nerd out on this stuff. So it was fun.
No, and Trudy Ann as well. I mean, Trudy Ann, we were both like, we have maybe several more pages that we could ask you, and we have no time.
Yeah.
It's been amazing, and we're really lucky to have had all these wonderful, wonderful, wonderful people. We're really touched and amazed, amused, and just generally quite excited.
Thank you.
And we shall see what happens over the next 12 hours.
This is where it all goes horribly pear-shaped.
Yeah.
The witching hours.
I'll take it in 11 and a half hours and see what's left of you.
Yeah. You go off script.
Yeah. Oh, we're well past that. Don't worry. Wonderful. Thank you so much, gents.
Thanks for having
have you with us.
Oh.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
That was brutal.
If you're,
we killed you, Dave.
Thanks.
So if you're still watching with us, bring down the screen. Come on, we'll tell everyone what's coming up next. So if you're watching with us, Oh, we're behind the scenes. Here we are. We're back.
We're back. We brought him
Stop doing
back.
what you're doing. If for those of you who are watching at home, we're about to end this broadcast. So this is the end of part 2. And then immediately after, part 3 will start. So keep an eye on either the Black Tot Rum or the Whiskey Exchange Facebook pages or the Black Tot YouTube. The new live stream will start up in just a second, and we've got another 12 hours of content for you. We don't know why. We should have stopped now. It'd be amazing.
Mitch.
This is already such an achievement. I don't know. Anyway, we're going to do it all again. Another 12 hours.
But gents, thank you very much. And over and out. We'll see you hopefully later.
See you in the next one.